Welcome everybody to this afternoon European time or morning America, etc. evening. Now we have the pleasure to have with us Wolfram Ziegler from Munich. He's going to talk about articulation and disorders or pathology or with whatever name it is. It is in general phonetics and well, this area, I must say that it has been developed during the last years. I mean, a couple or 3 decades ago, we hardly knew about those things. Okay, we had speech physiology and those things, but not in the way we have this science today. It has theoretical implication, it has medical applications, and it is a vital branch of linguistics in general. Wolfram has carried out research for many years, and he is an established researcher in the area. So we welcome you, Wolfram, and we will listen to you with great interest. Here you are, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonis. I will take the screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay. And you can hear me all? So
we can hear you and see you very well on the right window. It's perfect, Wolfram.
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for this kind invitation, Antonis. I'm very honored to be able to talk here, and thanks also for your kind introduction to this talk. I would like to give you a very brief overview of what we call neurophonetics. So most of neurophonetics deals with phonetic methodologies in the clinical assessment of neurologic disorders, for instance, to develop diagnostics for Parkinson's disease, etc. A much less known and much less common aspect of neurophonetics is the reverse approach, namely to study patients with speech impairment after neurologic diseases and to try to uncover principles of normal speech production by investigation their breakdown due to dysfunctions of relevant brain networks. This approach does not come without a problem. Apparently, any aspect of speech behavior we may observe results from some patterned brain activation. And what we usually do is that we build theories or models of speech processing and relate them to these neural processes. In neurophonetics, we draw inferences from the symptoms observed in patients with brain lesions, and we try to develop models of impaired phonological phonetic processing in these patients. And a very crucial aspect then, a crucial step then, is to say that what we have here is not an entirely new process generated by the impaired brain, but is a modification of something that also exists in the normal, in the neurologically healthy brain. This inference is a cornerstone of cognitive neuropsychology. It is implicitly based on a strong background assumption, the transparency assumption, which claims that the impaired function is transparent to the underlying normal function, as if only some circumscribed process has been deleted or subtracted from the normal speech production process. What we require to mitigate the transparency problem is we need to have a clinical model that provides an appropriate theoretical framework for such work. That is, it should have a well-established neuroanatomic substrate. It should incorporate converging physiological evidence from different resources, and it should not be inconsistent with existing processing models. Here I will introduce a clinical condition which is termed apraxia of speech, and I will claim that this condition is indeed a clinical model that fulfills the mentioned requirements. Apraxia of speech is characterized as an impairment of articulation planning, a process that has been described under different names in different speech production models. This goes back a very long time, until Broca's time in the 1860s. And Broca, a French neurologist, examined the brain of a patient he has long accompanied over several months. And this patient was nearly speechless. He could only say a few syllables. He was called Monsieur Tan. And Broca described this disorder as the loss of the faculty of articulate language. He characterized these patients that they have preserved motility of articulators, that is, they can move their articulators freely. They have normal intelligence. They have preserved hearing and preserved language comprehension, and they have something like a preserved lexicon, everything in the terms of this time, of Broca's times, which was really different from now. And what Broca said is that these patients have lost the memory of the procedures that we need to articulate words. So in modern terminology, we would say they have a loss of the procedural memory for speech movements. So what Broca is known for is that he described the lesion sites of his patients. And he said that it is the third frontal convolution that is implicated. And after a couple of patients he has seen, he knew that it is always in the left hemisphere of their brains. So Broca's message then was that there is a region in the anterior cortex of the left hemisphere which houses the acquired implicit knowledge of how the speech organs are controlled for the production of words. I would very much like to present you a video here of such a patient, which I cannot due to privacy reasons. So we have to content ourselves with this short transcript. The patient says, wir machen Großveranstaltungen einer Art Hausmessen zu den Themen Solarenergie und energiesparendes Bauen. You have a translation here. And what you see here is that the patient had very laborious, effortful, and slow articulation. He had sound distortion all around, that is awkward sound productions that we do not have in German. He has plain sound substitutions, one sound substitute by another, false starts and self-corrections, visible groping, visible searching movements of the lips and the tongue, a non-fluent and scanning rhythm, and a very high awareness of his impairment. And this particular patient had no aphasia at all. So many of these patients do have aphasia, but not necessarily so. And he had no paresis, ataxia, kinesia of the tongue or the lips, or that is the what we call the basic motor functions were unimpaired. And the patient described himself as that he forgot how it works, how articulation works. He has no grip to this faculty anymore. So there was really like 160 years of research, neurological research into this impairment, and many lesion studies, which more or less have all confirmed the same thing, namely that there is a lesion in the left hemisphere, in the anterior part of the left hemisphere. There are different methods to find this out in these patients. And since several decades, we also have very powerful functional brain imaging studies of normal subjects, of healthy subjects, and during speech, these subjects show always show brain activations in this area in the frontal left cortex. So we have a situation where we have a relatively clear neuroanatomic substrate in Broca's area, in the left ventral premotor cortex here, in anterior parts of the left motor cortex, and as some people say, also in the left anterior insular cortex, which cannot be seen here. So an important point is that this faculty is not present from birth. We have recently proposed a model how it evolves during the development of speech. So the left hemisphere capacity is only becomes available in the adult speaker. And this happens through extensive practice of speech motor patterns during language acquisition. And we know from many studies of neuroplasticity that there are structural and topographic changes in gray and white matter, changes at the synaptic level, reorganizations of neural microcircuits when we learn new motor processes, new motor activities. How does it come about? There are several parts of the brain who are known to be implicated in motor learning. Most of it is done by the cerebellar system, which devotes itself to sensory motor adaptation processes, coordination and timing, which is there from birth and stays there even in adults, because we always have to adapt to new situations when we speak and have to coordinate. Another system is the cortical striatal system, the basal ganglia, which are known to be implicated in motor sequence learning, and they have a strong contribution to speech learning from birth on. But this contribution seems to disappear more or less over time, and the basal ganglia have other functions in speech, for instance, like gain control, emotion, motivation, and initiation of speech. So the faculty, which is located here, is acquired through extensive motor learning during speech acquisition, and as such, it must be language specific. It's not a universal thing. And we think that it encodes the relative stability of phonetic patterns of the speaker's language due to this motor learning process. And what we know is when this region is damaged, this causes apraxia of speech. From this, we may derive a notion of like ease of articulation, which is known in phonetics and it's highly disputed in phonetics, where we define it in neurophonetic terms. So when we look at, for instance, the articulatory repertoire of German speakers, there's a blank slate in the newborn who has no access to this repertoire, no volitional access. And during development, we progressively gain fluent and highly automatic control over the entire repertoire. There's nothing in that repertoire except for perhaps some words or some complex things that are not easy for us to say. And this knowledge is represented here in the theory. And after stroke, the knowledge is disturbed, is destroyed, and the extent to which a patient is impaired, he or she will lose some of this knowledge or most of this knowledge. And this gives us a handle on a definition of what is easy and what is difficult in our sound repertoire. So easy words or easy patterns are those that are even preserved in those patients who have a severe disorder, and difficult ones are those that are impaired even in patients with very mild impairments. So the physiology behind it would be something like easy patterns are those that rely on highly redundant neural mechanisms due to the brain plasticity, and as such they are less vulnerable to loss of neural tissue and less vulnerable to apraxic failure and produce fewer errors when these patients speak. And the reverse holds for what we consider difficult. So to make an example, we asked like 120 speakers with apraxia speech to produce these two German words, Knecht and Blume, and 37% of them had accurate productions of Knecht, and 48% were accurate on Blume. So that we have this yardstick here where we can measure the relative difficulty or ease of articulation for these two words. And when we have many words, we can fill this yardstick with many different positions here. What are the factors that influence word production accuracy in these speakers? There are a couple of factors that are known for a long time, and we have examined many of them. One very apparent factor is the length of words. So 4-syllabic words have more errors than monosyllabic words. And also the complexity of syllables. So complex syllables are more difficult than syllables with words with syllables with only simple structures. One other thing that one can infer from our data is that, for instance, monosyllabic words with a CV structure are more difficult for these patients than words with a VC structure. So we have an influence of onset and coda. And one rather new study done by a colleague of mine, Ingrid Eichert, showed that in German, disyllabic iambic words are more difficult for these patients than the trochaic words, which are, most of our disyllabic words are trochaic. So we have influences on rather different levels, segmental, syllabic, metrical levels, and we need to have a model that describes all these levels at the same time. And what we did is we used a nonlinear gestural model, which we borrowed largely from articulatory phonology. And there are these layers. You will all be aware of this. Layers for different articulatory organs. We have a separate layer for the vocal, for the vowel production gestures. And then we have a gesture, for instance, the vowel gesture here in the word phonetics. And we assume that the probability that a patient produces this gesture correctly is a number P. So P is the probability of correct selection and activation of a gesture. So then when we have two gestures at the same time or combined, we may say that the probability that both of them are produced correctly at the same time is P times P squared. But this only holds under the assumption that the two are not connected or are activated independent of each other, which is probably rarely the case. So we have to correct using a multiplicative coefficient, which characterizes the degree of intergestural cohesion between the two, the coordination between the two. And when this coefficient turns out as 1, we would have mutual independence. When it turns out as lower than 1, we would have additional bonding costs because the probability of correct production goes down. And if it is larger than 1, which we would expect in most normal situations, then the two gestures are integrated. They are no longer two different events that have their own probability of going awry. And in this situation, we would have a specific coefficient which characterizes the onset condition here, the onset gesture. And this is another onset gesture which receives the same coefficient, and it also is a glottal aperture gesture, which is synchronous with a labial gesture, which is characterized by another coefficient. And so, to make this long story very short, we go through the whole gestural display here, and each of these gestures gets their own coefficients describing their bonding strength with their neighboring gestures. And after that, we also take into consideration the metrics of the whole thing. So we characterize the gestures in weak syllables of a medical food by certain coefficients, and also the gestures in the upbeat, in the left branching part of this phonological word. So having this, we can now collect data from many words, as we've done here, as I showed before. And for each word, we can now apply these equations that we have derived right now. And so when we have like 240 test words, we get 240 equations like this, and we can resolve this system using nonlinear regression. And having done this, we see that these whole 250 words, their degree of difficulty as expressed by their accuracy in apraxic speakers can be explained by 12 model coefficients to a rather high degree of 71%. The interesting thing then is to describe the model coefficients, to analyze the model coefficients that go in there. We have different types of coefficients, as I said before, some of them describing the constriction type and organ, synchrony of velar and glottal gestures, syllable structure, and medical food structure. And what we see here, for instance, I make only a few examples, when we use different gestures in a row, different organs in a row, that is impedes the whole thing, that makes it more difficult than when we have the same gesture all the time. Or this one is facilitating, that is producing two gestures at the same time, glottal or velar gestures together with lingual gestures, is facilitated. So it's not as difficult as we would expect from the situation that they are two gestures, in fact. We have onset effects and coda effects. We have negative effects here. We have a positive effect of the tails of a metal foot, and we have a negative effect when we have a left branching expansion in a phonology word. So in this manner, we can now, for each word or non-word that conforms to German phonotactics, we can calculate these numbers. We call them NLG scores, nonlinear gestural scores, and finally, it's in principle, it's like a projection of a multidimensional hierarchical relation to a one-dimensional scale of speech motor complexity that we have here. And speech motor complexity defined in terms of apraxia of speech. We have developed a web-based web application to calculate these scores. So you enter here like a sample transcript of any word, and you indicate the stressed syllables, and then you get this nice display of the gestural score and this number, this energy index, characterizing the degree to which this this word is vulnerable to apraxic impairment. There are a couple of clinical applications for this thing. This is why we have developed it ultimately. But I would say that we also can use it for in a theoretical way and for speech research more generally. And here the transparency assumption that I mentioned earlier comes in. That is, we have to take this serious and say the relative differences between these gestural scores, they apply to normal speakers as well. That is, for instance, that producing a lingual gesture together with a velar aperture gesture or a glottal aperture gesture, it makes things easier than one would predict from having two gestures at the same time. And with this assumption in mind, we can then use these NLG scores to compare them with other lexical parameters or to use them in questions relating to speech acquisition. And I would like to show only very few tentative examples to show you how this is meant. We can use our web tool to feed it with word lists or even large lexicons. For instance, we used the subtitle-based lexicon of German here, and we can now compute the NLG scores for one-syllabic, disyllabic, and three-syllabic words, and you see that there is the strong influence of syllable number, but you also see that there are monosyllabic words that are more difficult than certain disyllabic words, or even than some of the three-syllabic words. So this is a more complex measure of articulatory complexity than only like word length. Then we can plot this the NLG score together with log word frequency. For instance, here, this is more than 12,000 German words, and you see that there is a rough correlation. That's what we would expect, that that frequent words are easier, are not as complex in our terminology than rare words in German, which is something that would, of course, expect. There's one other thing to look at: the influence of lexical stress. We have here only disyllabic German words, like 4,000 disyllabic German words with different phoneme numbers from 4 to 8, and we distinguish here between first syllable stressed, that is trochees, and second syllable stressed, that is iams. And we see that consistently the iams are predicted to be more difficult than the trochees across all these phoneme numbers and across all the other influencing factors that we have here. And this is certainly due to these two coefficients that I've shown before, the one that describes, characterizes the gestures in the unstressed syllable of a metrical foot, and the left branching unstressed syllables in a iambic foot. This is another way of applying these gestural scores. We have here a study of word acquisition as judged retrospectively by 60 adult raters. It's a study done by Schröder and others a couple of years ago. And we see much less of a correlation here. There is a tendency that easy words, less complex words are acquired earlier than more complex words. And this is not about word forms, of course, it's about concepts. So young child may acquire the concept of Hubschrauber, which is, what is Hubschrauber? It's helicopter. And this is rather early acquired and is a very complex word in German. And when we have a sample of a child, 60 months old, and he, of course, does not produce the full form of this. He produces something like that, and which has an energy scores like this, and he is 16 months old. So this is something that has been described by Feynman in her articulatory filter theory, saying that children have an articulatory filter when they produce complex words. They filter them down to some more accessible form, a phonologically more accessible form. And we have a couple of examples here drawn from a study done by Elson and cited in Feynman's work. And this is a child, a 1-year-old child, who produced very different words in complexity. So Zahnbürste, toothbrush is very complex, and owl is much less complex. So she produces them all, but in roughly similar complexities. So Zahnbürste is Nana, Bauch is Baba, and oil is Isle. So she has a very small corridor on which she produces her whole repertoire of words that she finds interesting and that she uses. So this would be another example how we can use a complexity derived from apraxic speech to some other topic of interest. So I'm concluding here. I have introduced the left posterior inferior frontal cortex as a center of higher speech motor functions. And its capacity is a result of learning-based plasticity, and a damage to this region causes apraxia of speech. And I've introduced the NLG, the nonlinear gestural model, derived from accuracy data from apraxic speakers. And we would say that this model describes the relative bonding strengths between articulatory gestures from the gestural up to the highest prosodic level, and it conveys a projection of hierarchical relations onto a one-dimensional scale. This score was developed for clinical purposes, but we claim that they can prove useful in speech research more generally. This is the EKN group. Thank you for your attendance and your attention. And I would like to thank my colleagues for their contribution. Ingrid Eichert and Anja Steiger were the ones who contributed most to this work that I have presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolfram, for this nice presentation. Now we can accept questions from the crowd. If anyone has any questions, please raise their hand. Yes, please, Martina.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear me. I can hear you.
A very fascinating talk. I was wondering, would you subscribe to the view to the Jacobsian way that language disorders are sort of a mirror image to language acquisition. It seemed that you were arguing along this way, although not saying it. And I was wondering, because you presented data on the complexity of syllables, and you said that VC syllables would be easier than CV syllables, and that would be a point that would go against language acquisition, I think.
Okay, thank you for this question, which is really interesting. I did not mention Jacobson and his theory for several reasons. One is that I would not subscribe to this theory because a developing child develops more than only the capacity that I have been describing here. So there are many more things going on in the motor system of a child. So we have this cerebral activity, the striatal activity, and the child has not developed all these components of the speech motor system. An adult person who has a stroke in the left hemisphere, the region I showed, still has all these capacities. So and the symptoms we see in these patients are not the same as we see in a child who develops phonology. And the other thing is the CV versus VC is something which is really remarkable because in articulatory phonology, the onset gestures have different relationship to the vowel than the coda gestures, and one would expect from this theory as well that that onset gestures are easier, which is not the case here, and which is also not the case in speech errors observed in normal subjects. So this is still something that we do not know, but the result is really very, very clear and has been replicated many, many times that these patients have fewer problems with coda consonants than with onset consonants.
Thank you.
Other questions, please? Yes, Julia.
Hello, thanks for your talk.
Hello, Julia.
Hi. I was wondering, towards the end, you mentioned Weimann's articulatory constraints for children, so it continues the discussion a bit on what you just talked about now. And you showed a few of what Weimann calls phonological templates, I think. Yeah. And I was just wondering if what you saw, do you think that phonological templates still play a role in adult speech?
No, I'm not saying this. So this is perhaps where the parallels have their end. What these patients do is that they often simplify things, which may then result in something that resembles the template. So when they have like blah blah, they would make perhaps ba ba, and they would also make ba ba if it comes to bra bra. But this is a far-fetched example and does not characterize very precisely what these patients are doing.
Mm-hmm. So there's no systematicity. For example, one patient prefers a certain template that then they reduce the consonant clusters to. You see what I mean? Like, of course, it could just be reducing the complexity as a whole, or it could be that they build up preferences for systematic simplification.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, they have certain preferences. For instance, they retain the metrical frame, so they do not make a disyllabic word from a three-syllabic one. They do reduce complex clusters many times, but not always. So there's no very strict rules. All of what I've been saying is like stochastic. It describes their behavior in a probabilistic way. That's why we need many patients, many examples to model their behavior.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks.
Any other questions, please?
I have a question. I just don't know how to use this.
Yeah, okay,
thing.
please go on.
Completely challenged technologically, I'm sorry. This was a great talk, I thought, and thank you, Wolfram. And my question is this, you know, I mean, one thing that I found fascinating is the way you, in fact, extracted parameters from, you know, the model that you constructed. And I wonder if you could imagine this type of approach being valid. I mean, I'm sure the answer is yes, but how would you imagine the extension of this type of approach to like higher level processes like, you know, morphology, syntax, and things of that kind? And the reason I'm asking is because unlike phonetics, in like the world of sentence processing, usually you simply use reasonably simplistic subtraction methods when you look at, like for instance, when you do it with fMRI, but it doesn't matter. Whatever continuous variable that you end up measuring, usually the way we operate there is just by looking at some fairly simple subtractions with some controls. And the question is, could you help us with this type of sophistication?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I've never thought about it in terms of like morphology or syntax. What we are doing right now is we ask whether the same model holds for the patients who have phonological impairment. They have different lesion sites, the more posterior lesions, perhaps more implication of the auditory system. We try to find out whether they conform to the same hierarchy, to the same model. And it seems that they are very close to, but that there are also differences, small differences. So that I think that there is like a continuum from the phonetics and phonology. They are not really different frameworks for the two. There would not be a very practical thing to have because they have to interlace very, very fast during speaking. So assuming a much different organization for phonology as compared to phonetics would not be a practical thing to have. If it comes to morphology, technically I might consider the methodology applicable. For agrammatism, probably as well. If you think in syntactic components, but to be honest, I've never thought so far because this is also not my field. But it's interesting what you are saying, and somebody should think about it.
Either he logged off or disconnected by accident, I'm not sure. Thank you for your answer. And now, Professor,
I'd like to put a very simple question. I mean, I'm skeptical about articulation planning, unless if we mean articulation, the whole sentence or so. But as far as consonants and vowels are concerned, do we have the time to plan? I mean to say, we plan up there, we communicate with intentions or communicative acts, and the central system say, make a request. And then down and down and down things are going automatic. So my precise question is, do we plan consonants and vowels, syllable structure, or once we have come down, let's say, to lexical level, things go automatic because we don't have the time?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So the word planning may be misleading or may have different meanings. In motor theory and motor research, we often have to distinguish between different levels of the motor organization.
Precisely.
So there are these levels like the brain nuclei in the brain stem, or the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. They have certain motor functions that we describe as more elementary, more basic. And then there is something that we would describe as like a knowledge of how it works. So when, for instance, when you learn a new language with very different patterns, you don't have the knowledge or the automatisms, the automatedness of producing these motor patterns. So you have lost the plans in this term. So the plan is, of course, something very, very automated. It is nothing that you reflect. So some have termed it a program. So you start the program and it runs down without any other thing to intervene. But we do need these different stages of motor processing. And in the case of apraxia of speech, there's a very important difference in that this motor aspect is in the left hemisphere, in that part of the brain where we have all the other language functions. And the lower motor components are all in both hemispheres. So there is some really very exceptional case for this kind of motor organization, what we call planning.
Thank you very much. Why am I not in Munich to come and hear and participate in your lectures?
Why
because
am I not in
I've been wondering about those things.
Yeah.
And I'm really sorry we are not, now we have over 30 grades here in Athens, maybe 33, 35. It's a pity we don't go out. If we were here, if we had here the conference, we would go and have a coffee under the trees and continue our discussion.
We have 5 degrees here.
All right. Well, okay, Wolfram, thank you very much. We have really appreciated your talk, and I hope to continue. As you must know, we have started now with tutorials, 1 tutorial per month. So we will have meetings and the conferences, and I hope we will meet again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.